Hello, my name is Sarah Klain, and my talk is going to be on the promise, peril, and paths forward for payments for rangeland ecosystem services. I'm an assistant professor of ecosystem services in the Environment and Society Department of Quinney College of Natural Resources at Utah State University. Just to introduce myself, I am an ecological economist. I'm really concerned about issues of sustainable scale, fair distribution, and efficient allocation. And in my academic worldview, I see our economy as embedded within society and rules and regulations and social norms and culture, and our society embedded within the biological and physical constraints of the environment. So I'm also really interested in environmental values. And I've done research related to instrumental and intrinsic values. Intrinsic value is this idea that nature has value independent of people, in contrast with instrumental value, which is that humans see nature as useful and valuable because of that use. And I'd like to note that Immanuel Kant noted that nature has either a price or a dignity. And I've done research to try to push back on this value dichotomy and try to overcome this conflict between instrumental and intrinsic value when it comes to promoting stewardship behavior. So I am going to give you a talk that looks at relational values as a way to try to overcome this intrinsic instrumental value dichotomy. Relational values can be experienced at the collective level when it's about how a collective, a group of humans relates to the environment. It can provide a source of cultural identity. It can provide social cohesion. It can give a sense of social responsibility and even moral responsibility to the more than human or non-human. It can also be experienced at the individual level. This can be a big part of individual identity. It can be embedded in ideas of stewardship and eudaimonia, which is this idea of what constitutes a good life. It can also be as a part of virtues that you experience and express. So I'm going to talk about relational values and ways to integrate them a little bit better into payments for ecosystem services programs. And the ultimate goal is ecologically sustainable and socially just outcomes. So this is a brief overview of where I'm going. We're going to start with a definition of ecosystem services, briefly go over what PES, payments for ecosystem services, are, the promise of them, the perils associated with them, and then insights to avoid some common pitfalls. And these insights are from social sciences beyond standard economics. So ecosystem services, they are benefits from nature to people. They were made popular in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2005. And it's this notion that human well-being relies upon ecosystem services. They're categorized in four major ways. There's provisioning, supporting, cultural, and regulating ecosystem service. And here's a visual of some rangeland ecosystem services, the provision of protein, biodiversity, provision, the ecosystem service of clean water, as well as identity and cultural values wrapped up in livelihoods connected to rangelands. So briefly, payments for ecosystem services are systems in which there is a recipient of a benefit from nature, for example, a downstream user of clear river water. And then that beneficiary makes a payment or series of payments to the providers of that stream of benefit. So in this case, it would be upstream landowners who maintain flows of clean water. And usually those upstream communities, they have to undertake actions that restore or prevent degradation of usually water-related ecosystem services. So there's a lot of promise to this idea of payments for ecosystem services. In the language of economists, PES are Cosian solutions to environmental externalities. So under the right conditions, parties to a dispute over property rights, they can negotiate an economically optimal solution, regardless of the initial distribution of the property rights. There's a lot of assumptions embedded in that kind of thinking, but this triggered a lot of excitement among economists and neoliberals, as represented in the cover of this Economist magazine. There were new PES projects initiated across the globe. However, now there's a little less enthusiasm for PES applications because there's a lot to critique about them. So there's a lot of perils with PES. At the root of it is this commodification of nature. It's often putting an economic value on something that historically we thought of as free and abundant, and now it's not as abundant, and we're putting this economic value on it. And that gets really messy and complicated. And there's also, of course, multiple values at play when managing the environment, not just economic value. So I'm going to go over 7 PES perils. So payments for ecosystem service programs, they can introduce new externalities. For example, so an externality is a cost burden on a party that was not involved in the original transaction. So the negative externalities associated with maximizing carbon sequestration in, for example, eucalyptus plantations, this can have a bad impact on biodiversity. It can also use up a lot of water. And it might even result in considerable soil loss and increased sedimentation. So this optimization of a single ecosystem service can come at the cost of providing other ecosystem services. And you can have these unintended externalities, these unintended consequences of PES programs. Also, there's this misplacement of rights and responsibilities. So in a PES program, you've got these ecosystem service providers or degraders that take particular actions that have impacts on ecosystems. And then these ecosystems provide these biophysical flows to the beneficiaries, who then pay the ecosystem service providers or pay them to stop degrading it. So that, in a sense, is giving the ecosystem service beneficiaries the responsibility to pay the provider of that ecosystem service. And then you've got government providing enabling rights and enabling structures for these programs. But usually you've got this idea of a polluter paying, somebody who's doing the damage should pay. In this case, you've got the beneficiaries paying to prevent degradation and to hopefully maintain that ecosystem service. So there's definitely some misplacement of rights and responsibilities in many PES programs. You've also got motivational crowding out, which is best explained using this example of a study of a daycare in Israel. Teachers were annoyed at parents being late to pickups. So they started fining parents for arriving late. And the number of parents arriving late increased. So this fine undermined the previous motivations that the parents had. The parents previously had wanted to maintain good relationships with the teachers. So the parallel here is that PES systems can undermine intrinsic stewardship motivations. So there's potentially landowners, ranchers, farmers that are caring for land because they feel it's the moral thing to do, rather than because of a payment that's conditional on that care. And once you introduce money into a relationship, it really changes the nature of the relationship and makes it much more transactional. So you really want to be careful of crowding out intrinsic stewardship motivations by introducing payments into a system. There's also this challenge of efficiency and equity in PS programs. PS programs can suffer from prioritizing efficiency at the expense of social equity. They can perpetuate existing power imbalances and hierarchies. They may even perpetuate poverty. Smallholders are often mostly left out of PS programs because of the transaction costs incurred. And it's just easier to work with large landowners rather than many small landowners. And also those who are already conserving nature before a PES program is introduced, they often can get left out. There's also this monitoring burden. If you have a rigid accountability framework where you have to measure how much of an ecosystem service is being generated, and then you introduce financial payments into this system, it's expensive. It's often expensive to monitor this. And also when you try to buy behavior change, you get more people who are probably in it primarily for the money, and then that makes cheating attractive to some. There's also, in general, this limited applicability around the world. Many have critiqued PES as being an inadequately private solution, i.e. you commodify an ecosystem service, to public issues of environmental quality. Also, this environmental quality may impact more than a cohesive set of stakeholders. So as Roche et al. Noted, PES markets have not emerged at the scale required to address global sustainability threats. There's also resistance to top-down prescription. So if it's a PES program that the government does, there's often resistance from the local level to this top-down prescription. And there's often resistance to the lack of flexibility and the lack of a policy being custom tailored to a specific context. For example, in the Northwest, a lot of farmers resist no-touch riparian buffers because they want to actually manage the buffers and get rid of, for example, Himalayan blackberry bushes from these buffers. So this is also an issue. So in trying to move forward, there's many suggested shifts for each kind of problem. I don't have time to go deeply into the suggested shifts and the tools for these new approaches. I encourage you to take a look at a paper that I'll list later that goes deeper into this. But I do want to mention how there's a lot of thought that's gone into this. And at the root of it, it's really embedding more explicitly relational values into these suggested shifts. So it's really trying to figure out how to reward good stewardship. Maybe instead of paying for a measured quantity of an ecosystem service. There's also these ideas of shared responsibility, stewardship, equity, and fairness. Like figuring out how to integrate that into policy is a major challenge and a potential way forward to make PES programs more just and more sustainable over the long haul. So all in all, I want my take-home message to be that PES programs have a long ways to go to figure out how to cultivate rather than suppress stewardship norms and identities. And I think there's a big opportunity to more explicitly embed relational values into payments for ecosystem services. So I think that PES tools, they can help engage dryland stewards to potentially maybe store carbon, but they've got to have policies that are locally adapted and that accommodate diverse livelihoods, support biodiversity, and also respect context-specific social and cultural values. So there's this major challenge that remains of finding socially acceptable PES systems that can hopefully work to increase biodiversity and potentially enhance carbon sequestration to address the climate crisis. I just want to emphasize PES, they're not a panacea to these often wicked environmental management challenges, but they can be useful in some contexts. So hopefully I've clearly shown you how what ecosystem services are, what PES programs broadly are, their promise, the perils, and some insights to avoid these pitfalls that are connected to this idea of relational values and embedding stewardship into PES programs. I encourage you to take a look at these references. I include my email there below, and I want to acknowledge SRM as well as USU, the people who invited me to give this talk, and also the knowledge I gained from my time at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at University of British Columbia. Thank you.